Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name's Deborah Hatswell, and you're listening to BBR Investigations. The case I'm sharing with you next comes in from a young lady who has experienced several haunted homes growing up, which raises the question, is it the homes that are haunted, or the lady herself? And she said, "Dear Deborah, it's been a while since I first touched base with you. I thought I'd share some of my experiences that your listeners may enjoy. As you know, I enjoy your content and I'm ready to share my story now. Back in 1990, when I was 17, nearly 18 years old, I moved into a shared house in a small rural town called Lewes, and that's situated just outside the coastal town of Brighton in the south of England. The house had 4 floors to it. There was the basement floor, and that had a kitchen and a sitting room, and that led to the back door, out into a lane, and that went to the train station. The first floor had my small bathroom, 2 toilets, and a bathroom with a hallway to the front door, and a staircase that went to the upper floors, and a second set of stairs that passed my room. The second set of stairs led down to the basement, and the second floor had 2 bedrooms and a second set of stairs up to the converted loft space, which was converted then into another bedroom. The house was filled with a mixed bunch of well-educated divorcees, middle-class arty types, which didn't have enough money to get their own place, really. I stood out as a young teenage girl who was clearly into metal, heavy rock music. I was studying art and drama at the local college. I was working part-time, dancing for stag parties, and I hung out with local bikers, etc. I was actually a very nice young lady, albeit a bit rebellious and headstrong. So the property was very basic and was filled with second-hand furniture. There were no carpets downstairs, and some wooden boards, creaky old stair kind of thing. I was the only person sleeping in the downstairs section. There was nobody and nothing below me but our communal living space. I moved in late September. College had already started, and this little room was perfect for me. It was at the back of the house, above the back door, with a view out to the trees, and on a quiet country lane. Outside my window was a big honeysuckle plant, and when I opened my window up, I would get this lovely scent that would drift into my room in the evening. I was really happy living there. As I started to get to know the other people living in the property, I became aware that they would normally socialise in the evening downstairs, with glasses of wine and a shared meal. Eventually, I started to join them, gradually coming out of my shell a little more each time. And when people were down in the communal area, I could hear them moving. You'd hear the dining table chairs moving around, and the sofa feet would scrape against the wooden floorboards. You could access the basement by some old creaky stairs that started directly outside my bedroom door. So I knew when people were going downstairs, as I would hear them. Also, there was a gravel yard from the back door that led to a small gate leading out to the lane, and you could hear people crunching up and down the gravel path to that door before coming in, and you'd hear all that from my room. One evening, I'd been working on a project for my art class, and I decided to go and make a coffee. I could hear the chairs moving around downstairs, and I figured I'd have a chat with whomever was there while the kettle was boiling. I walked down the stairs, calling out a hi as I went, and I found no one there. I could have sworn someone would be there. I hadn't heard the back door go, and I heard the gravel. Puzzled, I made my coffee and went back to my room. A bit later on, I could hear the same noises again, and again I went to investigate, and there was nobody there. Now, the house I'd grown up in had weird stuff going on all the time, and I knew plenty in regard to ghostly activity. I was not impressed with the idea that I'd moved into another haunted location. I really tried not to dwell on it too much. I had a really busy social life at the time, and I wasn't always there. As the months rolled on, the activity became much more apparent, and I started to question some of the other residents. None of them had any issues. I never noticed anything strange. They implied it was my overactive imagination, and I felt pissed that they didn't take me seriously. I started to have my friends stay over with me. One night there was a bunch of us camping out in my room. When about 10 to midnight, we heard the stairs creaking outside my bedroom door, but we hadn't heard anyone come down from the first floor or enter through the front door. We then heard the chairs moving around below us, and we all decided to have a nose around and see what was going on. We crept down the stairs and noticed there were no lights on. Clearly no one was actually using the rooms, and no one had left as the back door was locked. We set the chairs, to confirm the noise, and a couple of my friends went upstairs to listen. We moved them around, and they confirmed that it was the same noise that we could hear in my room. Eventually, we all returned to my room and waited, and then it happened again. We ran down the stairs this time and switched the light on, and there was nobody there. We honestly sat round for most of the night waiting to see if anything else would happen, with us all being there, but it was just quiet. None of my friends doubted me after that, and I felt quite validated. I stayed living in the house, and I didn't feel threatened by it, and at some point, I had a friend sleep there on the sofa for a few weeks after he'd got kicked out of his parents' home. He was into a bonfire society that celebrated bonfire night every year on the 5th of November in a big way. We do it in Lewes each year. He had a red Indian costume that he was preparing as part of the coming festival celebrations, and he'd been threading coloured beads to the breastplate in his spare time. The costume was about 80% completed when one morning he called me down into the living room space and said, "Look what that ghost did." And I looked at his costume, and all the beads had been taken off and rethreaded into a different pattern. It would have taken weeks to do, and I'd seen it the night before. It was perfectly done, but completely the wrong colour pattern than had been there previously. I was shocked, and he moved out after that experience. Things would get more active from, say, spring into summer, and the following year, and at one point then, when I was very low in my mood, it drove me so mad that I ended up shouting at it. It was daytime, and the chairs downstairs were moving constantly. There was no one else in the house, and I was in my room trying to sleep. The back door had opened and shut, but no gravel was moving or the gate closing. My window was wide open, and I was fed up with this ghost trying to get my attention. It went on all day till I shouted at it, and then I left to go and see a friend. I came back the next day and it was all quiet again, thankfully. Around this time, I'd started to date a local biker who lived on the other side of Lewes on a farm. He was a lovely guy, rode an XS1 1000 chop that was his pride and joy. Eventually, he took me to meet the guys who lived with him and informed me that it wouldn't be a good idea if I stayed overnight, as their house was haunted too, but not in a nice way. I pushed him to explain more, and him and his friends told me that several women were known to have hung themselves on the premises over time, and that whenever, time before girls were staying overnight, some strange things would happen. And she said, I visited the old farmhouse several times before staying overnight, and I did not experience anything unexplained. I hated going to use their loo though downstairs, but I would push aside my fears and just use it. The guys would often tell me to take the cat with me, as he'd hiss if the ghost was about. But I never did this, but some of the other visiting girlfriends did. I'd begun to think that the group were just telling a yarn to scare us all, when we were all had a strange experience one evening. I was going to stay over, as it had got very icy outside. It was a bit of a walk back to mine. The conversation went quiet when one of the bikers told us to shh very abruptly. And then we heard a musical note being strummed from an old mandolin. that was on the floor next to the sofa. He played a couple of cards and then went still. The cat had been asleep on an armchair opposite, suddenly sprung up and leapt out into the kitchen. We looked at each other and the conversation turned to stories about the ghost. One of the farmer bikers who'd moved out had been alone in the house one evening, and this was when they had first moved in. Only been there a few months. He'd been sitting on the sofa watching the TV, and he suddenly heard a door slam from the upper floors in the house. Now, the layout of this house was quite old-fashioned. Everyone entered it from the yard, and this led straight into the kitchen. To the left was a toilet and shower room area. All the rooms were very dilapidated and almost unstable. The kitchen led into the living room, which was an oblong shape. And behind the wall on the right was the door to the stairs that led to the first floor bedrooms. To get to the second floor, you had to walk through the main bedroom to another door and a set of stairs to that floor. The biker was convinced that someone was up there, and he grabbed a metal pole and he legged it upstairs to see who was up there, and he found no one in any of the rooms. But as he left the loft room, the door slammed shut behind him. The door in front of him opened, and he then ran for his life. Again, each door he exited through then slammed shut behind him promptly. They eventually found him at the end of the track that enters the farm property, crouched down and frozen. He was in his boxer shorts, his socks and his t-shirt, and he was absolutely panicked and refusing to go back into the building without his mates. I was also told it was freezing cold evening and there'd been a small snow flurry outside, but he still stayed out there until they'd checked out the house and came to get him. Apparently a vicar was called out to do an exorcism on the property. They had to remove all of their personal belongings from the house while this was performed. Comments were made about their choice of music, and they were told not to bring Led Zeppelin or the Ozzy Osbourne LP back into the building. I don't know if they did, but I know it was unlikely that a vicar would have performed an exorcism, as this rite was part of the Catholic faith. Perhaps they meant that he'd done a blessing on the home. I loved that story when they told it, but he decided to stay away and eventually went up to bed with my boyfriend. Nothing untoward seemed to happen during that night, but at breakfast we all noticed a picture that had been displayed on the wall the night before. That picture had somehow been taken off the wall and placed against the fireplace with its back to us. My boyfriend picked it up and we all gasped when he turned it around. The pictures were of 4 old-fashioned postcards. They were now in completely different sequence to how they'd originally been displayed. We looked back at the frame again and noted that the old tape hadn't been tampered with. This held the backboard to the frame. It was clearly intact all the way around. It was yellow and very old, as was the picture though. Again, a few weeks went by and nothing else really seemed to happen. And then one afternoon, the mandolin started up again, and an old electric fire came on by itself. That damn thing wasn't even plugged in. The main bar started to glow from that fire and emit heat at the same time when that mandolin strummed. We all got off the sofa and backed up away from the items while trying to work out how the fire had come on. After a few intense minutes, it had all calmed back down again, and we decided to trip over to the gardener's arms and lose. Shortly after this, my boyfriend moved in with me at my place, and I didn't have to stay there anymore. A year or so later, my boyfriend and I decided to move to North Cornwall. We moved back to my mother's house in Portslade while we prepared for our move. This was the house I'd grown up in, and it made me feel so uncomfortable as a child. It was a semi-detached 3-bedroom property just around the corner, to Portslade train station. And being an only child, I'd never slept well in that house at all. We'd never moved. My parents had bought the property back in the mid-60s. My room as a young child had been in the smallest room. It had an airing cupboard in it and a sink. The kitchen looks out onto the back, and we had a good-sized garden. Outside my room was the landing, with a loft hatch above. On the right was the second bedroom, and I stayed in this when I was 13 or 14 years old, until I moved out. The landing was an L shape leading up from the stairs, and the bathroom was directly above the front door that was downstairs, and my parents' room was at the front of the house, next to it, directly above the old sitting room. As a child, the sitting room had been used as a bedroom for my granddad, my mother's father. He lived with us following the death of my grandmother in 1974. Then he passed in 75 in that room. After then, my dad knocked the dividing wall down so that the front room and the sitting room joined. He then built a wooden extension at the back. Later, my stepfather replaced this with a brick and glass extension, which included extending the kitchen. Downstairs was much bigger than the upstairs to this property as a result of that. As a child, I'd been told by my mother, but both this house and the one that joined to it were both up for sale together. My parents looked at both. My mother, who's sensitive and comes from a family on a maternal side who were clairvoyant, and also followers of the spiritualist church, said that that house had a very bad energy. There were locks on the outside in the main bedroom, and an empty coffin-shaped box filled with women's clothing in the back garden, half buried in overgrown grass. My mother chose our house, and all seemed fine until a few months after we'd moved in. My parents were sleeping in a little bedroom, the one I ended up with as a child, when one night they were woken up as things were levitating and vibrating in the room. The bed shook hard for several seconds, and a cup lifted up from the table. Then it all stopped. Everything went silent, and nothing else happened. When my parents were decorating the property, one day there was a terrifying disembodied scream that was heard by them and my mother's parents who were helping them. Everyone had been in different rooms, and my grandparents were downstairs. They all met on the landing just in time to hear a big bang sound that my granddad thought sounded like a gun. None of them were responsible for the scream, and the house next door was completely empty. My mother told me that a couple of years later, her milkman told her that the previous owner of the house next door had been hanged for killing his wife. He'd caught her with another man and shot her. He was apparently one of the last to be hung in that area. He'd been a really nasty man, and that's why the house next door had been on the market for so long. When the neighbours moved in, she never told them that story. I had an awful time sleeping in my little room. As soon as I left the cot and was given a bed, I'd leave my room every night and sleep on the landing, outside my parents' bedroom. It drove them mad, and they put a lock on the outside of my door to try and keep me in there. And this led to me waking up and feeling frozen with terror. I wouldn't move. I'd be sweating with fear, sure that something was standing over me. I became very sick around that age, about age of 4, and I had to go into hospital for a few months. I remember feeling so at ease there, and I slept well every night. I made a full recovery, but I remained a sickly child while I slept in that room. It's also interesting that around this time, my grandparents passed away. My maternal grandmother passed away when I was 3 or 4, following several strokes. I don't recall many memories of her, but I was very close to my granddad. He used to teach me boxing and feed me his bacon every breakfast. I loved having him around. And at this stage, in the living room and the sitting room, they were separated still, and there was no extension. My granddad had a room at the front downstairs, and he passed away in there a year after his wife died. Even after the 2 rooms were opened up to make the living room, I always felt like he was close by. One family friend who was a medium told my mother he'd always be by her side, and I believe he still is. I recall around 1999, I'd been visiting my mother with my baby son, and we were sitting in the living room watching him crawl around. He needed to be changed, so I sat on the sofa. I took out the things I needed to change him, and I knelt down on the floor with him. I took out his soother and I put it onto the sofa behind me to keep it clean. After I finished changing him, I turned to get it, and it had gone. I searched everywhere. I took off all the cushions and blankets, previously on the sofa during the search. My mother looked too, and after half an hour, we just gave up, frustrated. She left the room to put the kettle on. I put the cushions and the blankets back on the sofa. I went over to where my son was. We all walked back over to the sofa, about to sit down, when I noticed the soother sitting in the middle of the centre cushion. It was exactly where I'd left it. How did we miss it in our frantic search if it was there all the time? There was another time I was helping to put some shopping away in the kitchen. I turned around and I noticed a loaf of bread was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor at the other end of the room. No one was near it. I hadn't seen it move. It just went from the shopping bag over to the sink to sitting on the floor on the other side. The whole event was completely nuts. Getting back to 1991, my boyfriend and I were preparing to move to Tintagel in North Cornwall. We'd moved in with my mother and stepfather for a few months beforehand, and now I had a lovely friend back then who went out with a guy who followed the left-hand path. My boyfriend was a member of the Bards, the Ovates and Druids, and I was studying Wicca. I was having a nap in my room, and my boyfriend was reading. When I suddenly woke up, I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. I could see, out the corner of my eye, my boyfriend was on the floor reading behind the curtain, and it was moving, but there was no breeze. I felt really cold, and I started to meditate using the white light method. And after a few minutes, the sensation of being paralysed did seem to wear off. It felt, or I felt, compelled to call my friend, and I felt really worried about her. She was alone at her home at the time, and she said that her boyfriend was having some serious issues with other Satanists. My boyfriend and I went over to her house immediately and felt some oppressive energy outside the home. We'd only been there about 20 minutes, and my friend told us that there was a black cat, a domestic one, sitting outside her patio door, just staring at her. My boyfriend tried to shoo it away, but it just kept growling and hissing at him. The cat then started to walk back and forth in the garden, never taking its gaze off us. We sat around and performed a protection meditation for an hour, and eventually it disappeared, and the energy seemed to become normal again. We went to bed and all seemed well. When I returned home the next day, my mother told me that she'd had a terrible night. There was a couple of cats screeching outside in the back garden most of the night, and she had an awful nightmare of a big black cat with piercing red eyes that was stalking her. The reason my boyfriend and I were going to Cornwall because we'd made friends with some local witches while on holiday there, and we decided to open up a New Age shop with them. We become friends with them following a terrifying night where my boyfriend and I experienced some really weird goings on. We were in our third day of our fortnight holiday then. We're camping in a caravan site in Tintagel. We'd ridden down on my boyfriend's motorbike, travelling around Cornwall sightseeing. We found a museum in Boscastle that was dedicated to witchcraft and had spent the day there. We'd met another couple of bikers from Wolverhampton and found out that they were staying in a B&B in Tintagel, and we got chatting. We all made our way back to Tintagel, where we met up with some locals and chatted about where we'd been that day. They were very knowledgeable and gave us a lot of info on the area. My boyfriend and I went back to our tent and arranged to meet up with the Wolverhampton couple for some drinks in the Cornishman later that evening. A storm rolled in, and after dinner at the Cornishman, we decided to have an early night. The storm was really bad as we left, and as we walked back to our tent, I noticed a dark shadow sweep along down towards the trail to the old ruins. I had an ominous feeling, and I became hyper vigilant. As we entered the caravan park, I felt like something was following us, and I was filled with dread. I told my boyfriend, and we tried to do some meditation, but I couldn't focus. After an hour, I was desperate to use the local facilities. I had to traipse across a field in the pitch dark, and it was sheets of rain. As I left, a fox made a terrible shriek that sounded god awful. I started to run. I nearly wet myself because I was so afraid. At the shower block, I entered the toilets, but I felt like I couldn't shut the door. I sat on the toilet doing my business, just staring at the entrance. I thought I could hear growling, but the wind was whipping up, so I could have been mistaken. I ran back to the tent as fast as I could, and I told my boyfriend, and he suggested we go back to the pub and collect ourselves. It was about 10 p.m. and still quite early. It was also late October, so that's why it was dark. And as we walked back past the track towards the ruins, I felt really emotional. I started to cry. When we got to the pub, we ordered some stiff drinks, sat in a quiet area by the front door. Just then, a couple from Wolverhampton came in. They looked really stressed, but told us we looked like we'd just seen a ghost. So we told them our story, and they said there'd been a rapping on the glass at their bedroom window. They looked at the window and saw what appeared to be a handprint on the outside of the glass. That was why they'd come back to the pub. We all felt really uncomfortable, and I decided that we should go and see if we could locate the local couple we'd all met earlier. They told us where they lived, and we all turned up on the doorstep just after the pub shut. We explained what had gone on, and we sat all around meditating on protection before returning to our beds. The local couple gave us rose quartz to take back with us, and I felt much better returning to the tent. The following morning, we unzipped the tent to see a real mess around us. Another tent had been blown apart, and all of the belongings were scattered across the field. Bins had been blown over, and an old static caravan was damaged. Our tent and motorbike were completely undisturbed, and we slept like a log. As we walked back into the village, an ambulance was coming back up the track from the old ruins, and only a couple of locals walking their dogs had found another suicide, sadly. When we met up with our Wolverhampton friends, they too had slept really soundly and not experienced anything else that night. The rest of the holiday was just spent in Tintagel and Bowcastle after that. We moved there in 92 and experienced even more strange events. This time, we saw lights over the old ruins on Tintagel Head, and we saw some strange green and red orbs flying into our bedroom at night. The locals told us about UFOs that they'd seen out over the Atlantic Ocean, and the strange lights that had been seen on the ruins were a regular event. We must have seen them 3 or 4 times in the first year. We stayed there a couple of more years before finally returning to the Lewes area following family issues. My boyfriend and I split up in 96, but all my strange adventures have just kept right on, year in, year out. I've experienced a string of incidents around my friend's now ex-boyfriend and made some intriguing discoveries as a result. I remain open to all kinds of phenomena, and I use my senses to guide me throughout life. I have a reoccurring voice that talks to me, even argues with me sometimes, that saved my life, and even told me that someone was going to die. My partner and I experience synchronistic activity almost daily, and he also has had lots of personal experiences in his life. I believe we were brought together by it. I think you probably were. I have a great belief in that myself. I think me and Mark were brought together. It's almost like both of our lives led us in that direction. I have an experience in my family from the castle at Bow Castle that she speaks about. And it was one that happened to my second cousin Nathan. And he got in touch with me and said, "Hey, Deb, what? I know you're a paranormal investigator, so what do you think of this?" Now, Nathan's my cousin on the U side of the family, and honestly, he's quite famous. He's even received an Oscar for his animation work in Hollywood, many of the films you'll have watched. Early in his career, he was living in London, and he told me about some strange experience he had when he first moved there. And he said, "I had a flat in London and recently sold on, and on a few occasions while I lived there, I had a lot of weird things happen. Getting out of the shower one day, I felt a sharp blast of air blowing on my leg. I turned around to see the towel blowing in the wind. Well, there wasn't a window open. It was a tiny bathroom, so no draft could have come in from anywhere. The next week, I came home late from work, 1 a.m. I'm putting the dry glasses away. In the corner of my eye, I saw one of them move. I thought it must have been some moisture in the glass causing it to move. I dried it, I put it back and carried on. Again, it moved towards me. I checked it again. The glass was bone dry. The shelf was bone dry. So I put it back on the shelf. I turned away and I heard it move again. I looked at the glass and said, "Do that again." And the glass moved forwards towards me. I rang my dad, whose advice was to not tell anyone and sell up and get out of there. It's typical of my uncle, not that. A few weeks later, my ex-partner moved in with me. I told her about the weird happenings in my flat a few weeks previous. We were chatting in bed about Arthur C. Clarke, of all people, when we heard something metal fall onto the laminate flooring and bounce. And we joked, saying, "Oh, it must be a ghost. You go and see. Go and have a look what it is." The next morning, we were heading off to Devon. I looked in the hallway, and I found a tiny brass horseshoe. I'd been decorating that week, and there was nothing on the walls, as I'd been painting them. So the horseshoe had seemingly fallen out of thin air. I asked my ex if it was hers, and it wasn't. And there's nowhere it could have fallen from. It wasn't possible that somebody put it through the letterbox, as it was around a bend in the hallway. Anyway, I put it on the wall and we went to Devon. Our first stop being Boscastle. Now, there's a witch museum there. And when we walked inside, we couldn't believe it. There were hundreds of the same mini brass horseshoes that I'd found in the flat, hanging up around the museum. I just thought that was really weird. So when we got back from Devon, I emailed the museum, sending them a photo of my mini brass horseshoe and asking them if they'd ever had any stories of apporting brass horseshoes. And she said no, that they'd make a note of it. Now, they were not his only experiences at that flat, I can tell you, but we'll speak about that on another podcast that I am making on paranormal DNA lines. But yeah, but a strange case tonight. Now, as Mai said, there was a couple of points I wanted to go over. She explained that she has lived in a series of haunted houses, and I think it's more likely that she picks up on paranormal activity when she's in a place. And she said it started very young in a bedroom at home. And that tells me it's going to be a lifetime thing. It's probably always going to happen to her. And what she's learnt to do over the years is manage it, you know. Some people have a series of paranormal events and there's nothing they can do about it. It's just something you have to deal with in your life. But I hope you've enjoyed that. We'll be bringing you something else for you to have a listen to quite soon. But until then, thank you very much for tuning in. And I'll catch you all another time. Good night, everyone.